They remembered 1968 as the year the wind stopped sounding like wind. It carried something colder, something living, something that made the townspeople glance toward the old barn at the edge of the field and then quickly look away, as if acknowledging it might invite whatever hid inside to acknowledge them back. For years it had stood sealed shut, weathered wood nailed into silence, the ground around it barren as if the earth itself refused to breathe too close. No one farmed that land anymore. No one claimed it. No one dared to. But whispers persisted, traveling through kitchens, church pews, and school hallways, speaking of faint rustling in the night, flickers of movement behind boarded cracks, and the impression, never proven, always denied, that someone was still inside. Rumors were easy to dismiss until the smell came. A strange, unsettling scent drifted across the fields, faint but persistent, clinging to the morning fog like a warning. That was when the call was finally made. That was when men with tools arrived, driven less by courage and more by a quiet dread that the town had been ignoring something it should never have ignored. When the final board was pried loose, the barn didn't open so much as exhale, releasing the stale breath of years hidden away. And in the darkness beyond that doorway, eyes appeared. Too many. Too small. Too frightened to belong there. 17 faces emerged from the gloom, pale and silent, as though they didn't quite believe the world outside was real. There was no cry for help. No rush toward safety. Just stillness. Watching. Waiting. They stood as if they'd been trained not to move, as if moving without permission meant punishment even the rescuers couldn't protect them from. No one spoke at first, not the children, not the adults staring back in disbelief. The town had braced itself for tragedy, but what stared at them from the shadows wasn't simply tragedy, it was a secret carefully raised, carefully controlled, and carefully hidden. And as the children stepped into daylight for the first time, something colder than fear settled over everyone present, because the question wasn't how they had been trapped there for so long. The real terror was who had put them there, and why the silence around that barn had always sounded so deliberate. The first sign that something was deeply wrong wasn't a scream or a frantic call for help, it was silence, the kind that didn't belong in a place where life was supposed to exist. The rural town had always been a place of familiar noises, dogs barking, tractors humming, distant laughter drifting across open fields. But one summer evening, people began to notice a strange hush creeping in around the outskirts, lingering like fog that refused to lift. It wrapped itself around the abandoned barn at the edge of town, a structure so old and forgotten that it should have blended into the landscape, yet somehow it didn't. Instead, it demanded attention in the quietest, most unsettling way possible. Late at night, when the fields should have been resting under the peaceful chorus of insects, there were faint disturbances barely noticeable unless you were listening for them, the gentle scrape of something dragging across wood, the almost inaudible shuffle of movement that sounded too controlled to be wind, too rhythmic to be coincidence. People brushed it off at first, convincing themselves it was animals nesting in the rafters or the old boards settling into rot. But the silence that followed those moments wasn't natural. It was heavy and aware, as though whatever existed inside that barn paused only because someone outside dared to notice. Days turned into weeks, and the hush around that land began to feel like an unspoken warning. Neighbors started closing their windows earlier. Children were told not to wander near the fields. Even the birds seemed to avoid flying over it. There was an unshakable impression that the barn wasn't abandoned at all but deliberately muted, like someone had taken the sound out of that piece of the world on purpose. The longer the town ignored it, the worse the feeling grew, until the silence wasn't just something people heard, it was something they felt pressing against their thoughts, gnawing at the edges of their comfort, reminding them that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the ones that scream for attention but the ones that wait patiently, unheard, unnoticed, existing just beyond the line where curiosity turns into fear. The silence might have been ignored forever if not for the letter that arrived without a name, without a return address, and without any attempt to soften what it claimed. It appeared at the sheriff's office early one morning, tucked beneath a stack of routine complaints, written in a trembling hand that made it difficult to tell whether the writer was terrified, guilty, or both. The message was brief but devastating, stating that inside the sealed barn on the outskirts of town were children, many of them, who had never seen the sun, who had lived their entire lives in darkness, and who were never meant to be found. There was no plea for help, no dramatic flourish, Just a cold statement of fact followed by a chilling line warning that the truth would ruin more than it would save. For a long moment, the sheriff stared at the letter, torn between dismissing it as a cruel joke and acknowledging the uneasy feeling that had been spreading through town for months. Others read it too, and nobody laughed. Something about the tone of the letter felt real, too intimate, as if the writer knew every corner of that barn, every breath taken inside it. Words spread in cautious whispers, not shouted aloud but carried quietly between neighbors, shopkeepers, and families, the way fear passes hand to hand without anyone wanting to claim it. Some swore they knew who wrote it, while others insisted it had come from someone outside the town, someone finally unable to live with the weight of what they knew. Authorities debated, but beneath the arguments was a shared dread, because if the letter was true, it meant the whispers, the uneasy glances toward that abandoned structure, and the strange hush surrounding the land had all been warnings of something far worse than imagination. What frightened them most wasn't just the suggestion that children were inside but the implication that someone had managed to keep them hidden for years, right under the nose of a community that prided itself on knowing everyone and everything that happened within it. The anonymous letter didn't bring clarity or comfort, it brought a heavy sense of responsibility and a terrifying realization that they were already too late to pretend ignorance was innocence anymore. When the authorities finally gathered enough resolve to approach the barn, it wasn't with confidence but with a kind of reluctant dread, as if everyone already understood that whatever waited inside would change the town forever. The boards across the doors were old but strong, nailed with deliberate precision, layer upon layer as though someone wanted to seal not just an entrance but an entire reality away from the world. Tools struck wood, each impact echoing unnaturally loud in the still air, and with every board removed, the smell of stale confinement and years of unwashed life seeped through the widening cracks. When the final plank broke free, the barn didn't simply open, it released a suffocating breath of darkness, a heavy air that seemed to have been trapped too long. For a moment, no one moved. Then eyes began to appear in the shadows, dozens of them, reflecting the light like frightened animals but with far too much human awareness behind them. 17 small figures gradually emerged, thin bodies fragile as twigs, their skin pale and paper-like, their hair tangled as though time itself had knotted into it. They didn't scream or run or cling to the rescuers the way children normally would. They just stared, wide-eyed and uncertain, as if the world beyond the doorway was nothing but a story they had never believed. Some stood frozen, others trembled so subtly it looked like the air itself was shaking around them, and a few shielded their eyes from daylight as though the sun was something painful rather than beautiful. The rescuers spoke gently, but their voices sounded foreign inside that barn, like language had no right to exist in a place where silence had reigned for so long. There were makeshift sleeping areas on the ground, worn blankets, scraps of fabric, and crude attempts at order that hinted they hadn't simply been left there, they had been managed, watched, kept. The realization settled in slowly, horrifyingly, that these weren't children accidentally forgotten or lost, they were hidden, raised in confinement, conditioned to fear the world now staring back at them. And the people standing at the doorway understood in that moment that discovering them wasn't a rescue as much as it was the beginning of something far more complicated, because freedom was a word these children had never been taught and sunlight was not a comfort but an intrusion into the only existence they had ever known. What unsettled investigators most in the hours after the discovery wasn't just the condition of the children, but the realization that, on paper, none of them existed at all. The usual process began immediately: names, ages, family connections, but every question fell into a void. There were no birth certificates, no school records, no medical files, no trace in any county or state registry that these children had ever been born. They had lived, breathed, grown, and suffered entirely outside the systems that defined identity, as though someone had deliberately erased the possibility of them ever belonging to the world. Officials searched hospitals, checked neighboring towns, contacted social services, and reached into archives stretching back years, but every search returned the same haunting answer: nothing. The absence was louder than any confession. It meant someone had gone to precise, calculated lengths to ensure these children were invisible, that their existence depended solely on whoever controlled them. They were ghosts with heartbeat and breath, shadows given shape, but legally they had never taken their first breaths. Even the children themselves could not offer much clarity. Many didn't know their names in a way the outside world would recognize. Some seemed to have been assigned numbers, others had been taught odd phrases instead of identities, and a few clung to words that sounded more like commands than personal markers. The investigators had handled missing person cases before, tragedies involving neglect or abandonment, but this was different. This was organized erasure, a life engineered in secrecy. The unsettling truth grew heavier with every unanswered question. Someone had created an entire hidden population and sustained it for years without leaving a single trace. It forced the town to confront an unbearable thought that while they went about their ordinary lives, an entire generation of children was growing up in darkness not miles away, intentionally cut off from everything society claims to protect. The discovery wasn't just about saving lives, it was about facing the horrifying intelligence behind the act, a careful mind that understood how records work, how governments count citizens, and how to make sure 17 children slipped through every crack without ever being noticed. And as officials stared at files that should have been full but remained disturbingly blank, it became clear that whoever controlled those children didn't simply imprison bodies, they erased identities, ensuring that if the barn had never been opened, the world would never have known these children were missing, because officially, they had never existed at all. What unsettled everyone even further was that, despite being freed, the children did not behave like children who had escaped confinement. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. They didn't ask questions. They watched everything with wide, hollow eyes, reacting less to the people around them and more to something no one else could sense. Attempts to coax words from them met only with quiet, controlled breathing, as though language itself was forbidden. Doctors tried gentle conversation, rescuers tried reassurance, but their silence didn't feel shy or overwhelmed, it felt conditioned. Then, on the first night after their discovery, something happened that chilled every adult in the vicinity. As darkness settled and the farm fields went quiet, a faint sound drifted through the night air, a distant whistle, low and almost melodic, barely audible unless you were listening. The children heard it instantly. Every single one of them froze in unison, their backs straightening, their eyes snapping toward the horizon with a recognition that made skin crawl. The whistle came again, just a little louder, and their breathing changed, as if something inside them had been switched on. Some trembled, others pressed their hands over their ears, while a few whispered broken noises that sounded like beginnings of words they were terrified to finish. It was the first time the adults saw genuine panic in them, not panic from strangers or bright lights or unfamiliar surroundings, but from that sound alone. It wasn't random, and it wasn't the wind. It carried intent, like a signal sent by someone who expected obedience. Over the next days, it happened again, never at the same hour, never from the same direction, but always at night, always distant, always deliberate. Each time, the children responded the same way, not with curiosity but with instinct, like they had been trained to listen for it, to react to it, to fear it. Investigators tried to track the source but found nothing, and the lack of answers only made the situation more terrifying. It suggested that whoever had controlled them was still out there, still confident, still communicating. The silent obedience of the children wasn't just trauma, it was loyalty forced so deeply into them that even freedom couldn't loosen its grip, leaving everyone around them with the sickening realization that the barn had been only one part of something far larger, and the one who commanded those whistles had never really let them go. When investigators began to search the barn more thoroughly, they realized the horrors on the surface were only the beginning. Beneath a rotting section of floor, they discovered a hidden entrance leading to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air below was colder, older, and felt touched by something more deliberate than neglect. What they found underground wasn't chaos or desperation, it was order. Crude wooden tables stood arranged like a twisted classroom, their surfaces carved with strange markings and uneven scratches where small hands had likely traced the same motions over and over. Faded chalk lines covered a wall, not with lessons of letters or math, but with rules harsh, absolute, and terrifyingly specific. They were commands, etched with a determination that suggested whoever wrote them believed obedience was not just expected but essential for survival. Broken lanterns, scraps of parchment, and worn notebooks filled with clumsy handwriting revealed that the children had been taught things, but not the things any child should learn. Instead of stories or dreams, their lessons revolved around obedience, silence, hierarchy, and fear. There were diagrams of punishment, drawings of a faceless figure always looming larger than everything else, and repetitive phrases written like prayers meant to shape their thinking. The most unsettling discovery was a small corner arranged like a place of reverence, almost ritualistic, with personal items arranged neatly around a wooden chair as though the presence of whoever sat there was something sacred rather than monstrous. It became brutally clear that the children hadn't simply been hidden, they had been raised with purpose, molded to exist within a set of laws disconnected from reality. Every inch of that underground room spoke of long years spent shaping minds to accept confinement as normal and obedience as survival. Standing in that cramped space, investigators didn't just feel pity for the children, they felt a creeping sense of dread at the intelligence behind the design. This wasn't madness. It was structure. It was patience. It was belief. Someone had built an entire world beneath the barn, a controlled environment where childhood was replaced with conditioning, and freedom wasn't just taken away, it was rewritten into something dangerous, something forbidden. And the worst part was the unmistakable feeling lingering in the air that whoever created this place had never intended for it to be discovered, and that the room wasn't abandoned, it was simply interrupted. As investigators pieced together the unsettling clues scattered throughout the barn and the underground chamber, a chilling realization began to take shape. Whoever had controlled these children hadn't simply vanished long ago, they had been there recently, right up until the moment discovery became inevitable. There were signs everywhere that the place had been maintained, food supplies that were not yet spoiled, candles burned only halfway down, and freshly disturbed dust suggesting footsteps that didn't belong to authorities. It didn't feel like an abandoned prison, it felt like someone had abruptly walked away, as if warned too soon or prepared in advance for the day outsiders might finally break through the boards. There was bedding for an adult, clothing that did not match anything belonging to the children, and tools neatly placed as though waiting to be used again. More disturbing than the physical evidence was the behavioral proof. The children still operated under a presence that no longer stood in front of them. They seemed to wait for instructions that weren't coming, to measure their movements as though they still expected approval or punishment. That kind of hold didn't fade simply because a door opened. It lingered, embedded in them like a second skin. Authorities found traces just beyond the barn too. Faint footprints leading away toward the woods, tire tracks half erased by wind and dirt, subtle signs of someone who knew how to leave without being followed. It was as if this unseen figure had rehearsed escape the same way they had rehearsed control. People wanted to believe the villain was gone for good, that the nightmare had ended, but the evidence said otherwise. The timing of the disappearance was too precise, the exit too clean. It suggested foresight, planning, and an unsettling confidence that they could slip away and remain untraceable, even after a secret this horrifying was exposed. That realization brought a different kind of fear to the town and the investigators alike, not just fear of what had been done, but fear of what could still happen. Because somewhere beyond the edge of the fields, the mind that engineered this hidden life still existed, still free, still capable, and likely still watching, knowing exactly what the world had finally seen and possibly waiting to decide what to do next. As the children were placed under medical observation and temporary guardianship, it quickly became clear that their suffering wasn't confined to the barn, it lived inside them, surfacing when the world went quiet. Nights became the most terrifying hours. At first it was small, soft whimpers echoing from separate rooms, then it evolved into synchronized terror that no one could explain. Many of the children would jolt awake at the same precise moment, their eyes wide, breaths shallow, their bodies shaking as though they had been yanked out of the same nightmare. They didn't scream like ordinary frightened children, their fear was restrained, trapped behind their teeth, controlled even in panic, as if they had been punished before for giving fear a voice. When doctors and caretakers tried asking what they saw, the answers were barely whispers at first, fragments of words pressed through trembling lips. Over time, a pattern emerged in those fragments. They spoke of a presence they called the caretaker, not like a guardian but like a rule carved into their existence. They said he didn't need to shout because silence was louder in his hands. They spoke of footsteps counted instead of minutes, of a voice that never rose yet could crush them with a sentence, of an assurance he gave them that the outside world was poisonous and that daylight was a trick designed to steal them away. What unsettled everyone most was how unified their memories were. Children who had never been encouraged to speak to one another somehow shared identical imagery, identical phrases, identical fear, as though their dreams were rehearsed lessons they were forced to carry inside their minds. Even the smallest among them would wake whispering the same chilling promise they claimed he had repeated to them over and over, that if they ever tried to leave, if they ever forgot the rules, he would return, and returning wouldn't mean rescue, it would mean correction. The more they spoke, the more it felt like the caretaker wasn't just a person but an imprint, a living command still pulsing inside them, binding them long after his physical presence disappeared, leaving everyone responsible for their recovery with the terrifying suspicion that whatever controlled these children had never truly let them go and might not be finished with them yet. As investigators dug deeper into the barn's history, they discovered connections that made the nightmare feel far older and more deliberate than anyone had imagined. Local records, dusty newspaper clippings, and whispered accounts from elderly townspeople began to reveal a pattern that stretched back decades. There had been a family living on the outskirts of town, eccentric and secretive, whose reputation teetered on the edge between harmless oddity and menace. They were never violent in ways the town could prove, but there were always rumors. Neighbors spoke of children who seemed absent from school, of lights flickering in the dead of night, and of strange rituals glimpsed through shuttered windows. That family had vanished abruptly, leaving a homestead abandoned and untouched for years, a disappearance that had been written off as relocation or death, but the evidence in the barn suggested a far darker continuity. Some of the children whispered names and phrases that matched stories older residents remembered, names of people who hadn't lived there in decades, but whose rules, their caretakers' lessons, and even the positioning of the underground room mirrored the vanished family's practices. The connections were too precise to be coincidence. Investigators began to understand that the barn and its hidden chamber were not isolated incidents but part of a lineage of secrecy, training, and control that had survived beyond the family's disappearance. The rituals, the rules, the untraceable children, all of it hinted at a methodical design, passed down like inheritance, carried through time by whoever maintained the property after the original family left. What had once been dismissed as folklore or exaggeration became horrifyingly real. The town had been sleeping next to a legacy of manipulation, one that had quietly endured for decades, quietly cultivating control over children in ways that defied legal and social frameworks. The discovery reframed the entire story of the barn not just as a site of immediate horror, but as a nexus where generations of secrecy and cruelty intersected, leaving an indelible mark on anyone who dared to uncover it. What had been assumed to be a singular act of confinement now appeared to be a continuation of something far more organized, something that stretched beyond memory, beyond the limits of the town's understanding, and into a past that no one alive had been meant to remember. The realization was terrifying. The barn story was never about one group of children alone, and what had been found was only the visible tip of a much larger, more insidious pattern. As the investigation unfolded and the threads of the barn's history began to weave together, the town faced a terrifying truth. Discovering the children was not the end of the nightmare, but merely the moment when it became visible. Every revelation brought with it the unsettling understanding that the secrecy, the control, and the cruelty had been deliberate, methodical, and sustained over decades, and that the children were only the most recent victims of a cycle designed to continue. Authorities realized that the caretaker or caretakers, considering the generational links uncovered, had planned for contingencies, anticipating discovery and crafting escape routes, hidden instructions, and methods to maintain influence even from afar. The children's responses to the distant whistles, their shared nightmares, and the meticulously constructed underground chamber revealed a system of psychological conditioning that was almost impossible to unravel, leaving experts unsure where trauma ended and indoctrination began. More disturbing still was the possibility that the barn had never been meant to contain just these 17 children. It may have been a stage in a broader plan, a controlled environment to test obedience, fear, and survival over long periods, and the discovery might have interrupted a process designed to last years longer. The townspeople began to understand that the horror wasn't just in the barn itself, but in the knowledge that someone or a lineage of someone had been able to operate without detection, meticulously erasing records, shaping minds, and ensuring that the world outside remained oblivious to what was happening just beyond its boundaries. Experts warned that the psychological imprint left on the children would not fade quickly, and that even now, remnants of control persisted like invisible threads tugging at them in the dark, making their freedom fragile, incomplete, and uncertain. As the town tried to process what had happened, the collective fear shifted from disbelief to dread. The caretaker's disappearance did not guarantee safety. There was always the possibility that whoever had orchestrated the confinement, whether a single individual or a continuation of a long-hidden family system, could return. The realization struck with the weight of inevitability. The barn's secrets, the manipulation, and the hidden legacy of cruelty were not just historical horrors to be examined, but ongoing threats whose influence lingered, shaping the lives of those who had emerged from the darkness and ensuring that the town would never again look at the fields, the forest, or an abandoned building the same way.